morning. All right, so today we get to talk to you about ESSA planning and implementation in Pennsylvania. My name is Sam Cook, just like the singer. My parents had a sense of humor. I will not be singing today. But we are excited to talk to you a little bit about the basics of the law. How many of you have read ESSA or are familiar with ESSA? How many of you feel like I know this thing backwards and forwards? I could be up here. All right, cool. Well, then we'll have a good role to play. All right. So today, what we're going to cover is a little bit of ESSA 101. We're going to focus specifically on the 4 areas that we've identified here in Pennsylvania as really core and central to things that have changed between No Child Left Behind and the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. We're going to look a little bit at questions and considerations of how ESSA will impact Pennsylvania in those areas, including data, which I know all of you are very intimately familiar with and interested in. We're going to talk a little bit about PDE's process for engaging stakeholders. So what are we doing to make sure that as we're looking at the law and thinking about the opportunities that the law presents, that we're hearing from the appropriate groups, stakeholders, all of you. And then finally looking at the 4 work groups that we've assembled to really look at ESSA implementation in Pennsylvania. All right, so the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA as we're calling it, reauthorized the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. And President Barack Obama, when he signed the law in December, said, with this bill, we reaffirm that fundamental American ideal that every child, regardless of race, income, background, the zip code where they live, deserves the chance to make out of their lives what they will. So at its core, ESSA continues ESSA's legacy as a civil rights law with a few sort of changes. So with No Child Left Behind, we had a very prescriptive and very large federal role. And with ESSA, we're sort of scaling that back a little bit, and we're giving states and local education agencies the opportunity to really redefine a lot of the spaces that were prescribed under No Child Left Behind. So here's what hasn't changed. Standards, you still have to have them. We now call them challenging standards, and it's up to states to decide what challenging means. We also continue to have annual assessments. And assessments will continue to play a pretty important role in accountability, although not to the same extent that you had under No Child Left Behind. We also have disaggregation by race, low income, English learners, students with disabilities, those accountability subgroups that were so critical when they were established under No Child Left Behind. And then we will continue to have requirements to improve low performing schools, although the way in which those are defined and identified and the supports that we provide are now up to states to sort of establish and create. So basically, a lot hasn't changed, but the way that those things are implemented has changed significantly. It moves again from that very prescribed, heavy-handed federal role to one where states and local education agencies are really taking that wheel. So we're not going to get into every sort of corner and niche and cranny, nook and cranny of the law, but I just want to highlight for you all, PDE's website has an Every Student Succeeds Act corner. That really dives into 4 of the areas that my colleague Adam will sort of go into high level. And so one of those documents that you may want to check out is a crosswalk. So what we've done is we've looked at what's changed and what hasn't changed between No Child Left Behind and ESSA, and it covers 4 major areas. It covers accountability, assessment, educator certification, and educator evaluation. So it's a great resource. There's also some other links and materials that we would recommend that you check out there as well. So with that, I'll hand it off to Adam.
Thanks. Good morning. Good morning. We are glad to be here today with you on the first day where there's sun since the 3rd week of February, I think. So we'll get outside soon enough. As Sam alluded to, there are 4 main areas that PDE is examining through the work of stakeholder groups: assessments, accountability, educator certification, and educator evaluation. So on assessments, what does this mean for Pennsylvania? While annual assessments are still required, states are going to have new broad discretion in what assessments look like. So for Pennsylvania, these changes will focus the work that we're already doing to ensure that our statewide system of assessments are fair, meaningful, and valid measures of student performance. As many of you know, we're also around the state right now studying important questions around Act 1 or Senate Bill 880, and looking at state-level high school graduation requirements. So our work around state assessments broadly under ESSA and the particular examination relative to high school graduation requirements will inform the work. We're also doing what we can to ensure that our entire assessment system is working as intended. This is a moment in time to ensure that we don't have disproportionate impact on assessments, that specific aspects of test assessment and administration allow educators to get timely feedback to support instruction, and again, that we're attending to some of the unintended consequences in the graduation requirements regulation. So just as states have new flexibility in the area of assessments, we have significant new flexibility relative to accountability. Under No Child Left Behind, assessments were the main driver in accountability determinations, and you still have significant attention to assessment results for accountability going forward. ESSA requires states to develop accountability systems, but affords them flexibility in the design. So while ESSA eliminates both adequate yearly progress determinations and the 100% proficiency requirements, states will have the ability to select new non-academic indicators and will have new flexibility to ensure that there are improvement strategies beyond the elements that you saw in school improvement grants and some of the choice and charter provisions. ESSA also continues annual public reporting and requires detailed data breakouts by subgroup. And as we engage with stakeholders and as we work with the accountability team that's working with our ESSA implementation efforts, we're going to be coming back to the field to get regular feedback on how we can balance rigorous assessment and also fair accountability. In terms of both educator certification and educator evaluation, things are really much more broad, and states have significant new flexibility in these two particular areas. So highly qualified teacher provisions, those now go away. And so we're going to be asking ourselves some of these questions. Should any state licensing or certification areas be revisited? Are there currently unnecessary barriers in state policy that impact our ability to make sure we have highly qualified teachers in every classroom, and particularly in hard-to-staff areas, hard-to-staff subjects? Does the law foster any changes relative to the teacher shortages that we're seeing statewide? And how can we continue to ensure equitable access to effective educators? In the area of educator evaluation, so the biggest change relates to Act 82. So under some of the Race to the Top guidance, and then under ESSA waivers, you saw the federal government asking states to describe how student outcomes would influence teacher evaluation decisions. So right now, the relationship between student outcomes and teacher evaluation is really a function of Act 82 once we get through this transition year. So we're going to be asking ourselves, are there opportunities to improve efficiency and efficacy within the current system while maintaining educator accountability? And are there additional ways to address the complexities of teaching and learning while maintaining educator accountability for student success? So does that make sense to everyone in terms of how Act 82 continues to stand? And you're seeing some states around the country moving away from student outcomes and evaluation decisions. That's a discussion we still need to have, and it's one that our stakeholder groups will help us explore. So I think, having gone through those 4 content areas, I'm going to pass this back to Sam.
All right. So in terms of why we're all here, right? So under all of those 4 areas, and I would argue even beyond that, data plays a really important role in figuring out and reporting on, for ESSA purposes, assessment, accountability, educator evaluation, educator certification. You heard Adam mention this opportunity or potential chance to decouple student outcome data and assessment data from teacher evaluation. And while the law allows you to do that, there's still an expectation around reporting of certain outcomes that might still crop up. So I think it's important. One of the ways that I've been kind of thinking about the law is thinking about the difference between things that are mandated for accountability purposes, the stuff that you're going to use to differentiate schools, and the things that you're still going to be required to share information about, right? So those are almost 2 different buckets in terms of transparency and reporting versus the type of data that you're using to sort of create actions or mandate actions from an accountability lens. So in terms of those report cards, so under the section 1111, there's 2 report cards that are going to be required under ESSA. And so these are sort of a continuation of some of the report cards that were required under No Child Left Behind. So you've got a state report card as well as a local educational agency report card. or LEA report card. And a lot of the requirements for these two are going to overlap. So what you'll see is a lot of the data points that are required under the state report card are also mirrored under the LEA report card. We're going to focus today specifically on that state report card section. And one of the resources that I would encourage you guys to take a quick look at if you have a chance, the Chief State School Officer, CCSSO, created a memo back in January that really outlined a lot of these data reporting requirements. And so we're going to sort of pull from some of their analysis, because why do it yourself if you had someone else do it? So one of the key areas that I think is important to highlight is that your state report card is going to have two main buckets of information. One is going to be your descriptions. So for example, under ESSA, states will be required to detail what their state accountability system looks like. And so there's going to be a description. It's almost like a policy statement that's happening in your state report cards. There's a number of those different descriptions and policy statements that are going to be mandated to be included in that state report card. And coupled with that, there's data items. And so this is an area of the law where there is a lot of reporting. So there's a lot of things that ESSA is asking states to publish in a more transparent and easy to access way. So while federal control has sort of devolved a little bit to the states in terms of what actions you're required to do, they did sort of make up for it a little bit in terms of the transparency requirements and the reporting requirements that they're asking states and local entities to follow through on. So a good example of some of the data items that ESSA requires under a state report card are listed here. So the percentage of students in different subgroups attaining different levels of achievement on state assessments. Well, that's not very different from what we have right now. But there are some key differences, and we'll get into those in just a moment. So what data we need to report? So in addition to sort of those basics that we've had to report under No Child Left Behind, there's now new data requirements that are going to have to be published within your state report card. So one of the biggest ones is adding data on school quality and climate, preschool enrollment, and accelerated coursework. So things like dual enrollment or concurrent enrollment, advanced placement courses, et cetera. So this data is not going to be new data points. It's going to be data that you're already collecting and submitting to the US Department of Ed under the Office of Civil Rights Data Collection. How many of you are familiar with that? Great. So who can tell me a potential challenge with this from a state lens? Anyone? Don't be shy. No one?
Separate system.
Separate system, correct. So separate system, it's self-reported. There's a lot of areas of this where the law is saying, so this is what everyone's going to have to do. The implementation side is a little more fuzzy. And so what I think is important to keep in mind as we'll go through kind of the details of what the law says is that a lot of the kind of questions that are happening around, well, how the heck would we do that, are still pending guidance from the US Department of Education. So if you have questions, by all means, raise your hand and let me know. But just so you know, a lot of our answers might be, we're not really sure until US Department of Ed tells us what they'd like us to do. So that's a big question. How are we going to collect that? Right now, it's a biennial collection, so it's every 2 years. How are we going to make that something that's then reported on annually? What about the fact that it's self-reported? Is there any expectation on the state level that we're going to be looking and trying to clean up that data in any way? So those are all the questions that we have and that we have to kind of think about. But it's important to note that this is now a new element in terms of the state report card, even though it's not a new element in terms of things that you have to collect on and report on at the state and local level. So you're also going to be looking at data on educator qualifications, disaggregated by high and low poverty schools. So as Adam mentioned, there's not so much of the restriction on the highly qualified teacher side, but there is still this expectation that states will be sharing information about the extent to which low income and students of color will be served by inexperienced or ineffective or out-of-field teachers at disproportionate rates than their peers. And this is something that's connected to our state plan for ensuring equitable access to excellent educators. So there are still some of those tie-ins. Now, this third one is one that's generated a little bit of controversy. So per pupil expenditures of federal, state, and local funds, this is huge. This is a big deal. So what the Department of Ed through ESSA is asking us to do is within our state report cards, you have to include both personnel and non-personnel costs. Those terms are going to be up to states to define for each school and for every LEA. So this is a big deal, right? And I think it's important to note, again, we're waiting on some guidance, but this is also an area where from a state lens, we're going to have to come up with some definitions in order to sort of make sure that we're doing this well and consistently. because it's going to change. It's going to create significant changes at both the local and the state levels in terms of how we collect information, how we report on that information, what counts for what. So I think that's important to kind of highlight that that's an area we're going to probably be looking for a lot of feedback from the field on. Specifying which expenditures are attributable to which source, that's another big question as well. How do you sort of divide that neatly when we know that so many of our programs have braided funding sources? So while that's not a new requirement, or it is a new requirement under ESSA, this was something that was required under ARA, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. So it's something that states have had a little bit of experience with, but again, there's going to be a lot of areas that we need to sort of flesh out more detailed. Finally, disaggregation by student subgroups. So while we still have our same accountability subgroups as we had under No Child Left Behind, we're also adding homeless, military-connected, and foster students. So this is a big deal as well. Right now, Pennsylvania, like a lot of other states, has sort of inconsistent data collection practices for those groups. Particularly for our military-connected students, that's going to be something that's potentially a challenge for us. It's a challenge for a lot of other states as well. So we're sort of looking at other national groups to figure out what best practices look like around that. But it's important to note, again, that difference between accountability in terms of how you identify schools and accountability in terms of transparency and reporting. These are groups that are added for the reporting and the transparency side, but they are not added for the accountability side. So I think it's important to note that. So what do all of these things mean? So again, this is where I cheated and took CCSSO's analysis. So if you look at the numbers and just an average of what we would expect, what CCSSO's analysis says is that we're going to probably have about 120 descriptions, so those policy statements that we mentioned before. You're going to have about 2,100 data items for state report cards. And again, that's assuming a lot of things. It could be more, it could be less. You're going to have at least one item for every school identified in need of comprehensive or targeted support and improvement. So those are your new lowest 5 and 10%. You're going to have about 1,700 items for each LEA. You're going to have 6 data items for every public school and 18 for every public high school. Now, I think it's important to pause. This is a lot. And when our team looked at these numbers, we had Adam's face on. It was like raised eyebrows, the like, oh my God, what are we going to do? So I'll go back to a lot of this stuff is things that we're already collecting, but for different purposes. So one of the major themes that I've pulled from kind of digesting ESSA and looking at it is that a lot of what it's doing is kind of pulling things together and centralizing as a way of sort of then pushing it back to the state level and saying, okay, we're going to try to simplify and consolidate a lot of the things that us at the federal government are telling you to do right now under very kind of disparate arms of our programs. And this is another example. OCR's data collection, it's something you have to do, but now it's being reimagined in a very different way. And so I think these numbers are really kind of like, oh my goodness, how are we going to manage this? And that's not to say that the implementation won't be challenging, because it will be. But I think it's important to remember that the bulk of these data items that we're looking at in terms of the quantitative summary are things that we're already collecting. Now, there are some things that we might have to collect that we don't right now, depending on how we design our accountability system, for example. So Adam mentioned a non-academic indicator of school quality. So depending on what that is, we could pick one, we could pick more than one. We don't know what that might look like. It might be something that we currently ask school districts to report on. It might be something that's brand new. So I think there is a lot that will potentially move. And again, we are still waiting on a lot of guidance from the feds on that. But I think it's also an opportunity to get creative, right? So these are things that we're already looking at, data that we're already required to sort of share and report on, but it's being reimagined in a way that's supposed to sort of encourage a different lens on data that we already are asked to collect by the feds. So with that being said, there is a different way. One of the other biggest changes in terms of data is the way in which we're going to be asked to use that data that we're already collecting and reporting on. And the biggest change is that it's now going to have to be cross-tabbed. So what does that mean? That means all of those subgroups that we talked about back here, all these ones, you're going to have to cross-tab them each. So you're going to look at male Asian students who don't have a disability. That's one of your student populations. Yes?
Who's the end count?
That's a great question, and that's something that we're going to have to define, right? So that's a consideration. So when the state decides, when Pennsylvania decides what our end count is going to be, it's in part with this challenge in mind, right? Because whatever end count we're using could really affect, because you're going to have 40 plus student population groups, right? Now again, I'll keep saying it. This is for reporting only, not for accountability, right? We want to make sure we're getting that right, but that's a fabulous question because that's going to make a difference, right? Because when we're showing this information, and again, the purpose of this is to really highlight what we already know, right? There are these intersecting identities that create achievement gaps or are linked to achievement gaps that we're trying to sort of highlight and pull forward. But this is very different from what we have right now. And it's going to require a lot different collection and maintenance and reporting processes at both the local and the state level. So this is something we're going to have to think through really carefully to make sure we get the intent of the law right. Clearly, the intent of this is to make sure that we're continuing to shine light in areas where students are still struggling. But this is going to be a very, very big lift at the state level as well as at the local level. And again, there's a lot of expertise in this room. We encourage you to tell us, after you're reacting to this, what do you think we should do and think of as we're sort of contemplating this? Yes?
It says public schools, like
Yes.
charter schools,
Correct.
schools, are they considered public schools?
Yes, correct, yep. Yeah, and actually under ESSA, there's no distinction for charters. It's just charter schools. And almost all of the requirements mirror for both charter schools and public schools. So that's a great question. Any other questions before I pass it off to Adam? Yes?
If we're already reporting the majority of this data, right, and I'm assuming it's through PINs or through the civil rights collection, why can't that stuff be married in PINs? Like, I feel like every time there is something else in an initiative that the state has, it's like, oh, we're going to add this. Like, we're already reporting that data, so why can't that data be pulled from PINs?
Yep.
And just add those extra fields if they're extra. It doesn't make sense, right?
And I think that certainly is something that our team will be exploring. I think much like what the feds are doing and saying, hey, we know that we're asking you to collect in a million different places, let's try to centralize. That's a great intent. We know that what often will happen is as you're looking at all of your data collection, centralization and making sure that it's easier is often the goal, but then it maybe sometimes misses the mark in implementation.
So not even saying necessarily easier, but we spend so much time
right.
giving you the data, but it's like we need to analyze the data too. We need to implement
Correct.
changes with the data. It's like we're so busy trying to catch up to changes
Yep.
that keep coming.
No, so this for sure creates a significant capacity concern, and we recognize that. So I think one of the challenges or one of the things we'll be listening for are suggestions and feedback around how we do this well, recognizing that we hear on a daily basis those capacity concerns of you're already asking us to do a lot just to sort of get the data in the door. How do we then do what the law is really asking us to do, which is exactly what you said, actually do things with the data that shine light on meaningful pieces? Yeah, I think it's a great question. Yes?
To piggyback off her remarks, as a superintendent, my concern is that when we have issues like that come up, where we're already strapped with capacity, most of us had to create PIMS-related positions that we previously didn't have. We had to go into our budgets and find a way to create these. Please keep that kind of question in mind because, as we all know, we can't count on funding.
Right.
Right. So if I have to keep adding staff because the department or the U.S. department decides that they want to look at things in another way, then they need to pony up to pay for it.
Yeah, no, I think, and again, one of the biggest concerns, even at the state level, quite frankly, is this does create a significant lift. And the phrase unfunded mandate gets thrown out a lot. I think this is an example of, for some districts in some places, this is going to be a much more challenging lift than others. But we recognize that across the board, both at the state level and local level in Pennsylvania, there are a lot of capacity concerns that are going to make even just this one part of the law. And I think that's important too. This is just one part of the law. There are a lot of other areas of the law that Adam sort of breezed through and made them sound really nice that are going to be really tricky to get right and that are really important to make sure that kids across the state are going to be able to do all the things that they're able to do and deserve to be able to do. So I think we recognize that this is in some ways the most concrete to-do list in terms of ESSA. It's one of those areas where it's kind of clear what they want us to collect on. In terms of how they're expecting us to do that, Our hope is that the guidance will provide some suggestions on ways to do that well, but we know that a lot of this is going to be driven by how we at the state choose to sort of marry existing requirements, keeping in mind those capacity concerns. So absolutely, we appreciate you raising the concern. Anyone else? Yes?
Sam, when you talk about that end count, are you talking at the LEA level or the school level?
It would be at the school, no, it would be across the board for different subgroups.
We determine that in our accountability.
Yeah,
Where that sits and what the number is.
yeah. So I think currently it's at 30, am I remembering that
I
correctly?
forget if it's 30 or 40.
Okay, I think right now it's at 30. Under proposed IDEA rulemaking, for example, 11 has been thrown out as a potential end count. But they leave it up to states. There are some parameters under which when we choose that end count, we'd have to justify it. But the idea is that you want to strike the balance between not revealing personally identifiable information about different students, but also not excluding certain groups just because they didn't reach a high enough number. Anything else before we move? Yes?
Currently, OCR is reported biannually. With these new guidelines, will this be an annual process now?
So that's still something that we're waiting on. But it is an annual report card, so the assumption is yes. So because ESSA is saying you have to publish this information every single year, and it has to include the stuff that you collect for OCR, my guess is yes. Now in terms of, so that's where that sort of process question comes up. So if it's currently collected every 2 years, but now you're asking us to do it every year, where will that information channel to? Will it still go from LEAs to OCR? Will there be another way that states are expected to collect that information? So that's where that sort of how the heck do we do this part comes up, because you're sort of saying, hey, that stuff that you share with OCR every 2 years, we now want that to be included every year. Yes?
Just a quick note. On the old report card, date was a 2-year collection, but it was reported every year. So there may be ways that you can go ahead and report
Okay.
the OCR data.
Oh, that would be fun.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's the way we did make it. The other thing I want to mention is you're putting all this stuff together. I probably should say who I am. Up until last year, I did the state report card. You're putting all that together, and you're going to have all that information. I hate to tell you, nobody's going to read it.
Well, so what's interesting is U.S. Department of Ed is challenging states, or ESSA is at least, to make it accessible, and concise is a word that's actually used in the law. Now, I work in education policy, so I can tell you my perception of what's concise and a normal person is totally different. Every one-pager I've ever written has become a 5-pager. So I think part of the goal is to protect the process from people like me. So one of the things that ESSA asks states to do explicitly is consult with parents. So the idea here, the law actually is saying, if you ask a parent, and actually a parent who's learning English, ask them to figure out your state report card. That's the lens through which you should build and determine whether or not it's concise and accessible. And so that part of the law is actually pretty clear. Now, in terms of how you do that, given that there's this many things, right? So isn't that interesting, right? So make sure it's concise, but look at all this stuff we've got to do. And that's where I think we're going to have to think creatively at the state level, because up until this point, you're right, our report card has been sort of this thing that's really long. Even the SPP, which is like a concise version that's not used for this, that's a lot of stuff for people to parse through. So I think the ways in which we're sort of executing, again, that cross-tabulation piece, the ways that we're making the data kind of make sense from an average Joe perspective is going to be really important. And the law actually demands us to sort of think through that lens as we're pulling it together. Now, how you do that it takes a lot more work to be concise than it does to be to sort of go on and on. So, anyone else before we move forward? Yes?
The law does expressly state too, I believe, that you can't have a super subgrouping.
Correct.
So
Yep.
it's got to be broken out by each individual subgroup.
Correct. Yeah, that's a really important change in the law.
Did they say why?
Did they say why?
I don't remember.
I don't think they did. But if I could extrapolate, I'm not the U.S. Department of Ed, but I think a big challenge, and one of the things you're seeing with this crosstab requirement is, again, that a lot of times when you're sort of lumping data together around certain groups, it's easy to not sort of be able to understand some of the ways in which different discrete areas might impact more than others. So by pulling them all together, you risk not being able to sort of see particular gaps that may be important to address. So I think the idea here, again, if we're thinking through that theme of what ESSA does and doesn't change, I think what the law really challenges us to do is really think through the data that we collect, because in a lot of other ways, the federal government is kind of pulling back a little bit. And so what they're asking is sort of, we're going to ask you to look a little more carefully from a data lens and a reporting lens at some of these subgroups and areas that you haven't had to before. Anything else? Yes?
Does that mean that they're going to start splitting out some of the other racial groups that get lumped into white?
I don't think so. So the racial and ethnic groups still stay pretty much the same. Although that's a really interesting question. I was at a conference the other day that actually talked about, for Latino students, the challenges that presents, because oftentimes they'll be sort of lumped in and identified as white or Caucasian when they're not.
We have students in Middle Eastern or Pakistani, Israeli descent, and they get lumped into white even though parents don't want that. And they do have English language learner and other challenges that the typical white students in our district don't.
No, I think it's
They are underrepresented.
That's an important point. I think, certainly from the language perspective, ELL is still a group that you're pulling out. But I think that's a really important question and something, I'm not sure the extent to which the law provides us flexibility at the state level to sort of redefine or re-examine those racial and ethnic subgroups. But to the extent that we can, that's an important question that we'll certainly take back and explore. Anything else? All right, with that, I'm going to move it right over to Adam, who's going to wrap us up with kind of the ways that the state is working in the field to engage folks around questions like this and our other areas. Here you go.
So Sam said that I made the 4 big buckets seem nice. I don't know if that was the. So they're not good or bad. They're just broad. And after 20 years of relatively prescriptive federal policy in education, we've got to think about issues in a very different way. So in terms of assessment, federal government says you've got to assess annually in grades 3 through 8 in English, language arts, and math. You've got to assess once in high school. But what those assessments look like, how they feed into accountability determinations, that's up to you. Accountability, we still need to distinguish between schools that are doing well and schools that are struggling, but what those metrics look like beyond the fact that academic indicators need to carry a lot of weight, that's up to states. And in educator certification, educator evaluation, we have a great deal of flexibility, again, with the caveat around state policy. So in answering some of these big questions, as Sam said, this is a capacity issue for states, it's a capacity issue for districts and schools. We are going to be relying on the professional judgment of Pennsylvania educators. So the work of building our state plan is going to occur over the next 6 to 7 months. Our best guess right now is that our state ESSA plan will be due in December 2016 or January, February of 2017. So over the next couple months, we're going to be convening stakeholders to get feedback on how our state plan ought to look. We're going to be relying on guidance from the U.S. Department of Education, the results of the negotiated rulemaking, and we're going to hear from leaders in the General Assembly around how they think our response to new federal law should intersect with state policy. And the result of that work will feed into our state plan, which will be above the 5-page standard. All right, so stakeholder engagement. There are really 2 ways to think about this, but at the end of the day, Sam and I want to be sure you leave today knowing that however you choose to be involved, you can email, you can call. We really do want to hear from education stakeholders around the state. There are all sorts of examples around how unintended consequences of NCLB meant a lot of cost, a lot of energy on the part of districts and schools around the state, and we want to be sure that as we go forward, we have the most coherent and sensible education policy plan, and that really does depend on practitioners. So right now, 2 main lanes of stakeholder engagement. The first is general stakeholders. We had our first general stakeholder session on April 28th at Harrisburg Area Community College. We had 2 sessions, the same content, the same speakers. We just had a morning and an afternoon session to be sure we could get as many people through the doors as possible. I think in total we had about 250, 300 folks from all over the state who participated. And the outcome of that day was really setting the agenda for the 4 work groups in the areas of assessment, accountability, educator certification, and educator evaluation. So those agendas will be what the stakeholder groups keep going back to over the course of the summer and the fall. And we've asked those stakeholders to stay connected with the department, and we'll be providing regular updates both on our website and then through statewide education associations. Work group members. So we have the 4 work groups in the areas of assessment, accountability, certification, and evaluation. 19 to 20 members each. We had 400 applicants. We had 400 nominations for the 4 stakeholder groups, and then 200 individuals submitted full applications to participate in that part of the process. From those 200, we were able to select about 80 to serve on the work groups, and their role over the course of the next couple months is going to be exploring policy questions, working off of the agendas as developed by the stakeholders, and helping us draft state recommendations that will inform our state plan. So here's our anticipated timeline. We had the process of forming the work groups back in the spring. We had a first meeting of stakeholders and work groups on April 28th. The work groups will come together on June 14 and on August 30th. And they'll be working with 2 external partners. First is CCSSO, so the Council of Chief, is that me? Okay. Council of Chief State Schools Officers. So nonpartisan, content experts in these areas will be working with the work groups to explore relevant state policy, providing examples of how other states are examining this work, and consulting with the educators on these 4 work groups to develop some state plans. We've also engaged a research organization from University of Pennsylvania to help align the recommendations that come out of the work groups with the evidence base. So let's take assessment as an example. So if we as a state want to consider whether we want to take availability of flexibility under ESSA to allow districts to use an alternate assessment, maybe the SAT or ACT, what would that mean in terms of comparability for student outcome data in teacher evaluation? And so our partners from Penn GSE or from CCSSO will help develop recommendations, guidance, looking at the experiences of other states so that we've got a clear pathway going forward. So again, the work groups will be meeting over the course of the summer, and then everybody will come back together in October for a debrief. We will present the recommendations that have come out of the work groups. We'll talk about the research base. We'll look at examples from other states, and we'll unveil the next steps moving towards our state plan. Our goal in all of this is that educators feel heard. We'll be updating the PDE website on a regular basis. You can sign up for updates. I'm not sure there's any perfect way to stay in touch with 500 school districts around the state, but to the greatest extent possible, we want to be sure that you feel there's an open door, your questions are being answered in a timely fashion, and that we're transparent about this work. So this is just sort of the process that will guide the work groups and how the work groups will engage with the broader education community. Again, work groups will produce draft recommendations in each of the 4 areas: assessment, accountability, certification, and evaluation. We're hoping for 3 to 5 recommendations from each work group. I think if we have 20 recommendations for each and we have 80 total, we'll have a state plan that is sort of overwhelming to folks. So we're asking the work groups to focus on broad recommendations that can bring some coherence and order to how we examine these 4 areas. The draft report will be shared with general stakeholders and the field during that October session, and the framework recommendations will ultimately inform our state plan. It's important to note that there's a public comment window that's set out by USDE relative to the state plan. So even though we're making all sorts of provisions to get stakeholder feedback around the process that'll play out over the summer and fall, there's also the public comment window before submission of our plan to USDE. So that will be a second opportunity for folks to weigh in, provide comment, and the department will be providing responses on those. Okay, so next steps. We'll continue to monitor the federal rulemaking and provide the field with updates as we learn more. We'll be determining the timeline to develop a state plan. So as I said, we don't know if that's going to be an end of 2016 or beginning of 2017 thing, but we're We're going to have to back map from that due date. We'll continue to explore and explain the intersections between the new flexibility that's permitted by ESSA and current state policy, whether it's SPP, whether it's high school graduation requirements, whether it's Act 82, trying to make that as clear as possible. And again, collaborating with state legislators, educators, and other stakeholders to get to the best outcome that we can. So this is just to wrap up. You can send any questions related to ESSA to the department's resource account, which goes to Adam and Sam, and we take turns answering those. So we're committed to that. So far, it's been manageable. It might be a week or two before we can get back to you, but a member of PDE senior staff will respond to every email that comes in, and we'll give you the best guidance we can about how you can be part of this work.